3 silver coins rattled in Caleb Rivers' pocket. They felt like tiny bones, a final reminder of a life that was just about empty. He walked through Deadwood Creek that morning in 1879, and the sun beat down on him like a hammer on an anvil. The dust wasn't just on the ground. It was in the air, in his lungs, caked onto his skin with a layer of sweat. He was 26, but the hunger and the heat had carved 10 more years onto his face. 2 days without food will do that to a man. His stomach was growling a low, mournful song that only he could hear. The town square was buzzing, but it wasn't the happy kind of noise. It was a low, ugly hum, like hornets getting ready to swarm. Women hid their mouths behind their hands, whispering. Men stood in tight little knots, their faces dark as a coming storm. Caleb knew this kind of crowd. It was the kind that gathered to watch something break, something human. He saw old Pete from the general store and walked over. "What's all the fuss?" Pete spat a stream of brown tobacco juice into the dust. "Sheriff's holding a debt auction," he grumbled, not looking Caleb in the eye. "For the Brennan family. Samuel Brennan went and died, owed half the town. Now his widow's got to square it." Caleb's gut tightened into a cold knot. Debt auctions were the ugliest part of this life. He'd seen them before. Families ripped apart like old cloth. Men who'd worked their fingers to the bone watching everything they owned get sold for pennies. But there was something in Pete's voice, a darkness that said this one was going to be worse. A sharp bell clanged from the courthouse steps. The sound cut through the murmuring crowd, pulling everyone toward the center of the square. Caleb got pushed along with them, the 3 coins in his pocket suddenly feeling like they weighed 100 pounds each. Sheriff McMahon stood on a wooden crate. He had the look of a man who'd rather be facing down a rabid wolf. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called out, his voice rough. "We're here today to settle the final debts of the estate of Samuel Brennan." Behind him, laid out like offerings to a cruel god, were the pieces of a life. A few rusted farming tools. 2 cows so skinny you could count their ribs. A pile of worn-out furniture. But Caleb's eyes went right past all that, to the end of the line, and his breath caught in his throat. A woman sat on a simple wooden chair. She was straight as a rifle barrel, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her chin held high like a queen. Dark hair was pinned back tight, and her blue dress was faded from the sun, but clean. She couldn't have been much older than him. But it was her eyes that hit him. They were full of a fire that this whole dusty, miserable town couldn't put out. For just a second, those eyes swept over the crowd and landed on him. In that moment, Caleb felt a jolt that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with that fire. "Catherine Brennan," the sheriff announced, his voice dropping low. "Widow of the deceased, to be bonded for a term of 7 years to cover the outstanding debts of $47.30. Bonded. The word fell into the sudden silence like a stone down a well. Everyone knew what it meant, slavery, but with a prettier name. Caleb watched Catherine's face, expecting fear, expecting tears. He saw neither. He saw rage, a cold, hard anger that made her even more beautiful. "Do I hear $1?" the sheriff asked. The words sounded like poison in his mouth. A greasy voice from the back of the crowd yelled, "50 cents!" A wave of cruel laughter washed over the square. Catherine's jaw clenched, but she didn't look down. She stared straight ahead, her eyes like chips of blue ice, memorizing every single face that was enjoying her humiliation. $1, a big man with a rancher's swagger called out. Jim Bradley. He owned the biggest spread in the territory and grinned at his buddies like he was bidding on a prize sow. Caleb felt a sickness rising in his throat. These men weren't just bidding on her time. They were bidding on her soul. And she knew it. But what could he do? He had $3 silver to his name. Not enough to buy a decent meal, let alone a person's life. $2! Another voice shouted. The game continued. Caleb watched Catherine's hands, folded in her lap. They were clenched into tight, white-knuckled fists. She was a statue on the outside, but inside, she was at war. The unfairness of it all burned hotter than the Dakota sun. $2.50. Jim Bradley called, his laugh booming. "Might as well get some good cooking and cleaning out of the deal." And that's when she moved. Catherine Brennan stood up. The sheriff raised a hand to stop her, but she ignored him. She turned and looked directly at Jim Bradley. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, but it was so clear and sharp that it cut through every other sound. "Mr. Bradley," she said, "I trust you remember that bonded servants can be freed early for good behavior, and I trust you also remember that I know how to read and write, which means I know my rights under territorial law." The crowd went dead silent. You could have heard a feather drop. No one had ever seen an auction like this. Jim Bradley's face turned the color of a ripe plum. Catherine wasn't finished. Her voice got stronger, ringing with a power no one expected. "Furthermore, I hope you all remember that debt bondage requires the servant's consent to be legal. I can refuse any bid I find unsuitable." Sheriff McMahon looked like he'd swallowed a bug. "Now, ma'am, you can't—" "Yes, I can, Sheriff," she shot back, never taking her eyes off Bradley. "Read the law. Page 43 of the Territorial Code. A person can refuse bondage if they can prove the bidder intends harm or has a history of mistreating workers." Caleb stared, his mouth hanging open. This woman wasn't just surviving. She was fighting. She was using their own laws against them, with a courage that shamed every man standing there. She was magnificent. $3. The words came out of his own mouth before he could stop them. Every head in the square swiveled to look at him, the broke cowboy in the dusty hat. Catherine's eyes found his, and in that one look, something passed between them. Not pity, not gratitude. It was understanding, one lost soul recognizing another. $3 going once, the sheriff said, rushing it now, desperate to be done. Going twice. Sold. To the young man in the brown hat. The crowd started to break apart, muttering and shaking their heads. Catherine walked toward him, her step steady and sure. Up close, he could see the light dusting of freckles across her nose. She smelled faintly of soap and determination. "I suppose you think I should thank you," she said, her voice low. Caleb took off his hat, his hands suddenly feeling clumsy. "No, ma'am," he said, his voice hoarse. "I think you should probably hate me for being a part of this at all." She studied his face for a long, silent moment. "Why did you do it?" Caleb looked down at his own worn-out boots, then back up into those fiery eyes. "Because somebody had to," he said. It was the truest thing he'd ever said. And because watching them, it wasn't right. He had $3 less than when he woke up, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel poor at all. He felt like he'd just bought back a piece of his own soul. The walk to his cabin was silent. Not a comfortable silence, but a heavy one, thick with things unsaid. Catherine walked beside him, not behind him, her back still ramrod straight. She didn't complain about the heat or the dust. She just walked, her eyes scanning the horizon like she was memorizing a map, or maybe looking for an escape route. Caleb tried to think of something to say, but the words wouldn't come. What do you say to a woman you just bought? He'd acted on instinct, on a hot flash of anger at the injustice of it all. But now, in the quiet of the trail, the reality of what he'd done was crashing down on him. He had no food. He had no money. He had a cabin that was barely more than a pile of rotting logs with a roof that leaked when it even thought about raining. He wasn't a savior. He was just another kind of cage. After an hour, the trail opened up into a small, dusty clearing. In the middle of it stood his home. He saw the exact moment she registered what she was looking at. He saw the tiny flicker in her eyes, a quick tightening of her jaw. The cabin sagged in the middle, like an old horse with a broken back. The chimney was a crumbling pile of rocks, and the single window was just a jagged hole stuffed with an old burlap sack. This wasn't a home. It was a ruin. "It ain't much," he said, the words sounding stupid and small. She didn't answer right away. She just stared at the dilapidated shack. He had saved her from a rich bully, only to bring her to a place of utter poverty. The irony was so thick he could taste it, and it tasted like ash. "No," she finally said, her voice flat and unreadable. "It isn't." They went inside. The single room was dark and smelled of wood smoke and dirt. A rough wooden table with one wobbly leg stood in the center. A bed in the corner was just a pile of straw with a threadbare blanket. It was the home of a man who had given up. Catherine's eyes swept across the room, taking in every detail of his failure. He expected her to cry, to scream, to curse him for dragging her from one hell into another. Instead, she walked over to the stone fireplace, the only solid-looking thing in the entire structure. She ran a hand over the cool, rough stones. Then she stopped. Her hand froze on one particular stone near the bottom. Her whole body went rigid. Caleb's heart started to pound. "What is it? What's wrong?" She didn't look at him. She just stared at the stone, her face pale. "This fireplace," she whispered, her voice a strange mix of awe and terror. "I know this fireplace." That made no sense. How could she know his fireplace? He'd built it himself 2 years ago, with rocks he'd pulled from the creek bed. "That's impossible," he said. She finally turned to look at him, and the fire in her eyes was back, but this time it was mixed with a wild, desperate fear. "No," she said, her voice shaking. "The man who built this cabin, the man who laid these stones, he was my husband." The air left Caleb's lungs in a rush. He felt the floor tilt beneath him. This wasn't his cabin. He'd found it abandoned a year ago, assumed the owner had died or moved on. He was a squatter. And the woman he'd just saved was the widow of the man whose home he had stolen. The silence in the room was deafening. He was standing in Samuel Brennan's house with Samuel Brennan's wife, and he'd just bought her with $3 silver. The situation had gone from bad to impossible. Catherine took a shaky breath, her mind clearly racing, putting pieces together that he couldn't even see. "He told me he was building a second cabin," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "A place to hide, a place to run to if things got bad." She looked around the dilapidated room, her eyes seeing something more than just poverty. She saw a secret. "Things got bad, didn't they?" Caleb asked, his voice barely a whisper. She looked at him then, and her expression was terrifying. It was the look of someone who knew a storm was coming, because she was the one who'd been carrying it inside her all along. "You have no idea," she said. Her hands went back to the fireplace, moving with a new purpose. She wasn't just touching the stones now, she was searching. Her fingers probed the cracks, testing each rock. "He told me if anything ever happened to him, I was to come here. He said he left something for me, something to keep me safe." Her fingers found a loose stone. With a grunt of effort, she worked it free from the wall. Behind it was a dark, hollow space. She reached inside and pulled out a small, heavy leather pouch. It clinked with the sound of coins. But that wasn't all. She also pulled out a thin, leather-bound book. She held it up, her hands trembling. "My husband didn't die in an accident," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "He was murdered. And this is the proof." Before Caleb could even process the word murder, she opened the book. The pages were filled with neat, precise handwriting. Names, dates, numbers. It was a ledger. "What is that?" he breathed. "It's a record," she said, her eyes blazing. "A record of every crime my uncle Harrison Vance has ever committed. The real reason Samuel is dead. The real reason I was on that auction block today." She looked from the book to Caleb, and he saw that she wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a woman holding a weapon. "And now," she said, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper, "Harrison knows I'm gone. He'll be looking for me, and he'll tear this territory apart to find this book, which means he's coming here." A floorboard creaked outside. Both of them froze, their heads snapping toward the door. It wasn't the wind. It was the sound of a boot stepping deliberately onto the porch. A smooth, cultured voice cut through the afternoon quiet, a voice that was calm and pleasant and dripping with menace. "Catherine, my dear niece," the voice said, "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Harrison Vance had found them. It hadn't taken days. It had taken hours. Caleb's world shrank to the size of that tiny, broken-down cabin. Outside, the man who had murdered Catherine's husband. Inside, the woman holding the evidence. And him, the fool who'd stepped right into the middle of it all. He grabbed the old rifle he kept propped against the wall. It was a pitiful weapon, old and unreliable, but it was all he had. Catherine stood frozen, clutching the ledger to her chest like a shield. Through the cracks in the cabin wall, Caleb could see them. 6 riders. They weren't scruffy cowboys. They were professionals. They wore good clothes and better guns, and they sat on their horses with the lazy confidence of men who got paid to do terrible things and were very good at their jobs. And at their head was a man who looked like he belonged in a fancy city ballroom, not the dusty Dakota frontier. Tall, with silver hair and a perfectly trimmed mustache, Harrison Vance sat on a magnificent black horse. He was smiling, but it was a smile that didn't touch his cold, dead eyes. "Come now, Catherine," he called, his voice like silk. "Let's not make this unpleasant. You've had your little adventure. It's time to come home and settle our family business." Caleb moved to the window, keeping the rifle low. "What does he want?" he whispered, though he already knew. "The ledger," she breathed. "And me. He can't afford any witnesses." "Mr. Rivers." Harrison's voice suddenly focused on him. "I do believe that's your name. The gallant young man from the auction. I admire your spirit, son, but you've waded into waters far too deep for you." Caleb's grip tightened on the rifle. The wood felt slick with sweat. "I'm offering you a one-time opportunity," Harrison continued, his voice reasonable, friendly even. "You send my niece out, and you can ride away. I'll even give you $100 for your trouble. A considerable improvement on your initial $3 investment, wouldn't you agree?" $100. It was more money than Caleb had seen in 5 years. Enough to start over, somewhere far away from this mess. All he had to do was open the door and push her out. He glanced at Catherine. Her face was pale, but her eyes were locked on his. She wasn't pleading. She was watching, waiting to see what kind of man he really was. He had bought her freedom. Was he about to sell it back? He turned back to the window. "I reckon you can keep your money," he called out, his voice shaking only a little. There was a moment of silence. Then Harrison Vance laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. A man of principle. How quaint. "Very well. I gave you your chance." He turned to one of his men, a wiry, mean-looking man with a scar down his cheek. "Billy, it seems Mr. Rivers requires a more forceful sort of persuasion." Billy Stern grinned, showing a row of yellow teeth. He swung down from his horse and started walking toward the cabin, pulling a heavy pistol from his belt. Catherine's breath hitched. "That's Billy," she whispered, her voice tight with hate. "He's the one who held Samuel's head under the water." The cabin suddenly felt like a coffin. The walls were thin, the door was weak. Harrison and his men could be inside in minutes. They were trapped. "There's no way out," Caleb said, his mind racing, trying to find an angle, a weakness, anything. "Then we make one," Catherine said. Her fear was gone, replaced by that same cold, hard fury he'd seen at the auction. She moved to the fireplace, her mind clearly working. She wasn't thinking about surrender. She was thinking about war. "He thinks this is about the ledger," she said, tapping the leather-bound book. "He thinks it's about the land, the money he stole. But he's wrong." Caleb stared at her. "What are you talking about?" She looked at him, and a strange, dangerous smile touched her lips. "This was never just Samuel's fight. It was mine, too. Harrison doesn't know everything. There's a secret in this book that even Samuel didn't understand. A secret that will destroy my uncle completely." Billy Stern reached the porch. He kicked the door hard. The old wood splintered. "Time's up," he snarled. Catherine didn't even flinch. She flipped open the ledger to a page near the back. "Harrison thinks he's the only one in his family with a dark past," she whispered, her eyes glittering. "He's about to find out how wrong he is." The door buckled again under another heavy kick. The hinges screamed. Any second now, they would be face to face with a killer. And Catherine Brennan just kept smiling, like a woman who had been waiting for this exact moment her entire life. The door exploded inward, ripped from its ancient hinges by Billy Stern's boot. He stood there, framed in the doorway, a monster silhouetted against the dying afternoon light. His yellow-toothed grin was the stuff of nightmares. "Party's over," he grunted, raising his pistol. Caleb fired the rifle from his hip. The blast was deafening in the tiny cabin. The shot went wide, splintering the doorframe next to Billy's head, but it was enough to make him duck back outside. "They're armed," he yelled. "Give me the ledger," Caleb said, reaching for the book. "We can throw it out. Give him what he wants." "No," Catherine said, her voice like steel. She was no longer the terrified woman from a moment ago. She was a general commanding a battlefield of two. "Giving him what he wants is how we die. We have to change the game." Outside, Harrison's silky voice dripped with false regret. "I am so disappointed, Mr. Rivers. This could have been so simple. Now it must be messy. Men, burn them out." Caleb's blood ran cold. He saw two of the hired guns dismount, pulling torches from their saddlebags. They were going to set the cabin on fire and shoot them as they ran out. It was a classic, brutal tactic, and it would work. "He'll kill us all just to get that book," Caleb said, a desperate edge to his voice. "He's not trying to get the book," Catherine said, her eyes flashing with a terrifying clarity. "He's trying to destroy it. He doesn't want anyone to read what's on the last page." She shoved the ledger into Caleb's hands. "Read it," she commanded. "Read the last entry, out loud." Caleb fumbled with the book, his hands shaking. The last page wasn't filled with numbers and dates like the others. It was a single, sprawling paragraph, written in a different hand, a woman's hand. His eyes scanned the words, and his world tilted on its axis for the second time that day. It was a confession, but it wasn't Samuel Brennan's. It was a deathbed letter, written by Harrison Vance's own wife 20 years ago. It described how Harrison had murdered his own older brother, Catherine's father, to inherit the family fortune. The fortune he'd used to build his empire. Catherine wasn't just his niece. She was the rightful heir to everything he had. The land, the ranches, the money. It was all hers. Harrison Vance wasn't just a murderer and a thief. He was a usurper. And Catherine was the one person alive who could prove it. "My mother gave this to Samuel before she died," Catherine said, her voice trembling with the weight of old grief and new fury. "She made him swear to keep it safe, to only use it if Harrison ever came after us. Samuel thought it was just a story from a dying, confused woman. He never believed it. But I did." Outside, one of the torches flared to life, a bright orange flower of death in the twilight. "This changes nothing," Caleb yelled over the crackle of the flame. "We're still going to die in here." "No, we're not," she said. She grabbed the rifle from him. "He wants the book destroyed? Fine. We'll give him what he wants." Before he could stop her, she ripped the last page from the ledger. The confession. She crumpled it into a ball. Then, she did the unthinkable. She strode to the fireplace, where embers from the morning's fire still glowed faintly, and she tossed the crumpled paper onto them. The dry page instantly caught fire, turning to black ash in a matter of seconds. Caleb stared at her, horrified. "What have you done? That was your only proof, your only leverage." She turned to face him, and in the dim light he could see that she was crying, silent tears tracking paths through the dust on her cheeks. But her eyes were harder than stone. "Paper burns," she said, her voice a raw whisper. "But I don't. The proof isn't on the page anymore, Caleb. It's in me. I have every word memorized." The men with the torches were getting closer. He could feel the heat from the flames through the thin cabin walls. "Harrison!" Catherine screamed, her voice tearing through the air. "You want the secret? It's gone! I burned it! The only copy is in my head now! You want to silence me! You'll have to do it yourself!" There was a long, terrible silence from outside. The men with the torches hesitated, looking back at their boss. This wasn't the plan. Harrison Vance's smooth voice, when it finally came, had lost its silken edge. It was raw, furious. "You're bluffing, you little witch." "Am I?" she shouted back. "My father was a better man than you, a smarter man. And he left his legacy to me, not to his murderous little brother. You think your hired guns want to be accomplices to that kind of a crime? A crime against family? Ask Billy Stern how loyal he feels right now." Caleb saw it then. The genius of her move. She hadn't just destroyed the evidence. She had weaponized the secret. She'd planted a seed of doubt in the minds of Harrison's men. They were hired to bully a widow over a land dispute. They hadn't signed on to be part of a bloody family feud that stretched back decades. A new voice shouted from outside. It was Billy Stern. "She's lying, boss. She's trying to trick us." But his voice sounded uncertain. "Is she, Billy?" Harrison snapped, the pressure clearly getting to him. "Or have you all been working for a man who's been living a lie for 20 years? The gang was fracturing. Their solid wall of intimidation was cracking right down the middle. Catherine had turned them against each other without firing a second shot. She looked at Caleb, her face grim. "Now comes the hard part," she whispered. "Get ready to run." She grabbed the empty ledger book from the floor, took a deep breath, and threw open the cabin's back window. It looked out over a steep, rocky ravine. It was a crazy, impossible escape route, but it was the only one they had. "He won't risk shooting me now," she said. "Not while I'm the only one who knows the truth. But he will come after us, and he won't stop until one of us is dead." She scrambled out the window, disappearing into the darkness. For a second, Caleb hesitated. He looked at the chaos outside, the arguing men, the flickering torches. Then he looked at the dark, gaping window. He'd spent his last $3 on this woman. It seemed he was about to spend the rest of his life, however short it might be, paying for it. He took a breath and plunged out the window after her, into the cold, dark unknown. The fall was jarring. They tumbled down a steep, shale-covered slope, rocks digging into their backs and hands. Caleb landed hard at the bottom, the wind knocked out of him. Above them, on the ridge, he could hear shouting. The chaos Catherine had started was boiling over. "Burn the whole damned thing down!" That was Harrison's voice, ragged with fury. He had lost control. "Forget the woman. I want that man, Rivers. I want him dead." Torches were thrown onto the cabin's dry roof. The old wood caught instantly, and the night sky lit up with an angry orange glow. They were silhouetted against the flames. They had to move. Catherine was already on her feet, pulling him up. "This way!" she hissed, and they scrambled into the thick woods that bordered the ravine. They ran blindly, branches whipping at their faces, roots grabbing at their ankles. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit began. Men on horseback crashing through the undergrowth, their voices calling out to each other. They were being hunted like animals. "Where are we going?" Caleb gasped, his lungs burning. "There's an old trapper's line cabin," she said between breaths. "Samuel showed it to me once. It's hidden. If we can make it there, we might have a chance." It felt like they ran for hours. Every shadow looked like a hired gun. Every snapping twig sounded like a pistol being cocked. The adrenaline was the only thing keeping them on their feet. Finally, Catherine slowed, holding up a hand. They crouched behind a thicket of ferns, listening. The sounds of the horsemen were further away now, disorganized, spread out. They had bought themselves a little time. Caleb looked at her in the faint moonlight filtering through the trees. Her dress was torn. Her face was scratched and smeared with dirt. But her eyes were still blazing. "That was the craziest, most reckless thing I've ever seen," he said, his voice full of a strange new respect. "You gambled everything." "I learned from the best," she said bitterly. "My uncle taught me that you don't win by playing the hand you're dealt. You win by knocking the whole table over." A thought struck him, cold and sharp. "The page you burned," he said slowly. "Was it real? Was that confession actually written by his wife?" Catherine looked away, staring into the dark woods. When she finally answered, her voice was so quiet he could barely hear it. "No. His wife died before she ever learned the truth. I wrote it myself this morning, after you went out to check the fences. I copied her handwriting from old letters Samuel had." Caleb's mind reeled. The entire confrontation, the secret that had shattered Harrison's crew, the foundation of their entire escape. It was all a lie. A brilliant, desperate, soul-shaking lie. She had bluffed a man like Harrison Vance with nothing but a fake piece of paper and a story. He didn't know whether to be terrified of her or fall to his knees and thank her. "You are not at all who I thought you were," he whispered. She finally looked at him, and for the first time, he saw the terrible weight she was carrying. The fire in her eyes was banked, leaving behind a deep, aching sadness. "None of us are, Mr. Rivers," she said softly. "We're all just playing a part. The question is whether we survive long enough to choose our own." The sound of a horse whinnying nearby cut through the night. They were closing in again. The chase wasn't over. They scrambled to their feet and plunged deeper into the wilderness. The trapper's cabin was more of a hole than a home. Dug into the side of a hill and covered with sod, it was nearly invisible in the dark. They collapsed inside, the smell of damp earth and old pine surrounding them. They were safe, for now. The horsemen had passed their position, their shouts fading into the distance. For the first time in hours, there was silence. Caleb and Catherine sat in the darkness, their breathing slowly returning to normal. The adrenaline began to drain away, leaving a bone-deep exhaustion in its place. "They'll come back," Caleb said. "At first light, they'll pick up our tracks." "I know," she said. Her voice was flat, empty. The fight had gone out of her, replaced by a crushing weariness. "So what was that all for? The bluff? The fire? You bought us a few hours, maybe. What's the real plan?" She was quiet for a long time. The only sound was the drip of water somewhere in the back of the tiny dugout. "There is no plan," she finally confessed, and the words were a punch to his gut. "I've been running and lying for so long, I don't know how to do anything else. I thought if I could just break his confidence, make his men doubt him, we'd have a chance. But I didn't think past that. All that courage, all that fire, it was a mask. Underneath, she was just as scared and lost as he was. Maybe more. She had been fighting this war alone for years. "My whole life has been a cage," she whispered into the darkness. "First my father's house, then my uncle's, then Samuel's. Even you, Caleb. You bought me at an auction. You own me." The words stung him more than any bullet could have. "That's not true. I was trying to help." "I know," she said, and her voice softened. "And you did. You were the only person in that whole town who saw a human being instead of a piece of property. But it doesn't change the facts. I've never been free." He felt a profound, aching shame. He had thought he was a hero for a moment there. But she was right. He had participated in the very system that had trapped her. His $3 silver were just a different kind of chain. "When this is over," he said, making a vow to her and to himself. "If we get out of this, you're free. No bond, no debt. You can go wherever you want." She let out a small, broken sound, half laugh, half sob. "And where would I go? Harrison has poisoned my name all over this territory. I have no money, no family that isn't trying to kill me. There is no where for me to go." They sat in the silence of that truth. They had escaped the fire, but they were still trapped. Trapped by their past, by their poverty, by the simple, brutal fact that Harrison Vance would not give up. He would hunt them to the ends of the earth. Dawn was beginning to break, painting the tiny entrance of the dugout in shades of gray. With the light would come the hunters. "He'll be smarter now," Caleb said, thinking aloud. "He'll be angry. He'll send his men out in a proper search pattern. They'll find us." "I know," she said. She sounded defeated. But then, as the first rays of sun pierced the gloom, he saw her face. The exhaustion was still there, but something else was returning. A flicker. The first spark of a new fire. "He thinks I'm a runner," she said slowly, an idea taking shape in her eyes. "He thinks I'm a bluffer, a liar. He's expecting me to hide." She stood up, brushing the dirt from her torn dress. "He's hunted me for years. It's time the prey started hunting back." Caleb stared at her. "What are you talking about? We have one rifle with maybe 6 shots left. They have horses, men, enough guns to start a war." "We have something better," she said. and a ghost of her dangerous smile returned. We have the truth. Or at least, a version of it they're already starting to believe. And we know this land better than they do. She looked at him, her eyes challenging him. You said you found Samuel's cabin abandoned, that you've been living here for a year. You must know these woods, these hills. I know them, he admitted. Then you're going to help me set a trap, she declared. We're not going to run from Harrison Vance. We're going to lead him right into one. It was insane. It was suicide. But looking at the fierce, unbreakable spirit in her eyes, Caleb knew he was going to do it. He had started this journey by betting $3 silver on a stranger. Now, it seemed, he was about to bet his life. The sun rose higher, and the woods came alive with the sounds of the search party. Harrison's men were moving through the trees, their voices carrying on the still morning air. They were clumsy, loud city killers, out of their element in the wilderness. Caleb and Catherine moved like ghosts. He led them through game trails he'd walked 100 times, using the terrain for cover. He was a man who knew how to be invisible. And she was a woman with a plan. They're spread out, she whispered, as they watched from a rocky outcrop. Harrison is overconfident. He thinks we're just scared rabbits. We need to separate him from his men. How? Caleb asked. We give them a reason to split up, she said. She pointed to a fork in the trail below them. You're going to create a false trail, something obvious. Lead a few of them off on a wild goose chase to the east. I'm going to make sure Harrison and Billy Stern follow me west. Alone? You can't face them alone. I won't be fighting them, she said. I'll be talking to them. I planted a seed of doubt last night. Now I'm going to make it grow. She tore a strip of cloth from her dress. Here, she said, pressing it into his hand. When you're far enough away, fire the rifle. Once. It'll draw their attention. Then disappear. Her plan was terrifyingly simple, and it relied on perfect timing and a deep understanding of her enemy's mind. He looked at the scrap of blue fabric in his hand. It was the same color as her eyes. Be careful, he said, his voice thick. Courage isn't the absence of fear, Caleb, she replied, her gaze steady and intense. It's acting in spite of it. Now go. He did as she said. He moved quickly, silently, leaving a trail a child could follow. A broken branch here, an overturned rock there. He led them for half a mile before finding a good position. He raised the rifle, took a deep breath, and fired a single shot into the air. The crack echoed through the hills. Almost immediately, he heard shouts from the main party. Over there! To the east! He melted back into the woods, his heart pounding. The first part of the trap was sprung. Catherine watched as 2 of the hired guns peeled off, heading east in the direction of the gunshot. That left Harrison, Billy Stern, and 2 others. Perfect. She waited until they were close. Then she deliberately snapped a twig. Harrison's head snapped up. Did you hear that? Billy Stern drew his pistol. Over there. In the rocks. They moved toward her hiding place. She let them get close. So close she could see the fury in her uncle's eyes. Then she stepped out into the open. Hello, Uncle, she said calmly. Harrison stopped dead in his tracks. His face was a mask of rage. You! He snarled. Billy raised his pistol, but Harrison put out a hand to stop him. Where is the cowboy? Harrison demanded. He realized he was on the losing side, Catherine lied smoothly. He took his chances and ran. Can't say I blame him. Loyalty was never his strong suit. She was driving a wedge, making Harrison think Caleb had abandoned her, that she was truly alone and helpless. It's over, Catherine, Harrison said, dismounting. There are no more tricks, no more bluffs. This isn't a bluff, she said, her voice ringing with a conviction that felt chillingly real. It's a business proposition. You and I both know what will happen if I get to the territorial marshal. Your empire will crumble to dust, but maybe there's another way. Billy Stern laughed. You hear that, boss? She wants to make a deal. What kind of deal? Harrison asked, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. You sign over 1/3 of the V&V ranches to me, she said, naming his company. A long-lost inheritance from my father. Plausible enough. You give me enough money to disappear forever. In exchange, the story of my father's unfortunate hunting accident stays buried. No one ever needs to know. It was an audacious, brilliant move. She was offering him a way out that preserved his reputation and most of his fortune. She was speaking his language, the language of deals, of profit and loss. He was a businessman before he was a murderer. He would see the logic. But she wasn't looking at Harrison. She was looking at Billy Stern. And she added the masterstroke. Of course, she said casually. This deal is only for family. Your hired help would be a liability. Loose ends. I'm sure you understand. The color drained from Billy's face. He looked from Catherine to Harrison, the gears turning in his head. He had seen his boss's ruthlessness. He knew what happened to loose ends. He had been the one to tie them off before. Now he was one. Don't listen to her, boss, Billy stammered. She's trying to turn us. Is she? Harrison said, looking at Billy with cold, calculating eyes. He was actually considering it. The deal made sense. Billy was expendable. The other two men shifted nervously. Their loyalty was to the money, and the money was with Harrison. If he cut a deal with his niece, where did that leave them? In a matter of seconds, Catherine had turned a posse into a paranoid, dysfunctional crew on the verge of collapse. And then Caleb made his move. He appeared on the ridge above them, the rifle leveled not at Harrison, but at the other two gunmen. Drop your weapons, he said, his voice steady. Now. The two men, already spooked, hesitated. Their loyalty wasn't strong enough to die for. They threw their guns to the ground. Billy Stern spun around, his pistol coming up to fire at Caleb. But he never got the shot off. Harrison Vance, seeing his chance to clean house and finalize his deal, shot Billy in the back. Billy crumpled to the ground. It was over. The violence had been sudden, shocking, and decisive. Harrison stood over Billy's body, his own gun smoking. He looked up at Catherine, a grim smile on his face. It seems you were right, my dear, he said. Loose ends are so untidy. He turned his pistol toward the two now unarmed men, but before he could fire, a voice boomed through the woods. Drop the weapon, Vance! Sheriff McMahon and a dozen deputized townsmen stepped out of the trees, rifles leveled. Caleb hadn't just made a false trail. He had run. He'd run all the way back to town. The single shot Catherine had told him to fire wasn't a distraction. It was a signal. The real plan had never been to trap Harrison. It had been to delay him long enough for the law to arrive. Harrison Vance stared at the wall of guns, then at his niece. He saw her face, calm and triumphant, and he finally understood. He had been outplayed from the very beginning. Every move she made, every lie she told, had been one step in a much larger, more intricate trap. He had been so focused on the prey, he never realized she was the hunter. He dropped his gun. The fight was over. Justice, it turned out, had a way of finding you, even in the dusty, lawless hills of the Dakota Territory. The ride back to town was different. This time, Harrison Vance and his two remaining men were the ones in bonds, their hands tied behind their backs. The story came out, piece by piece. The forged confession, the years of abuse, the murder of her father, the cold-blooded killing of Billy Stern. Catherine told the sheriff everything, her voice clear and steady. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was a witness. When they reached the town square, the same crowd that had gathered to watch her be sold now gathered to watch her accuser be thrown in jail. Old Pete from the general store tipped his hat to her. Jim Bradley couldn't even meet her eyes. The power had shifted. Back at the cabin, her cabin now, truly. The silence felt different. It wasn't heavy or awkward. It was peaceful. The broken door was propped shut, and the morning light streamed through the single window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. So, Caleb said, breaking the quiet, what happens now? The lawyers will handle the rest, she said, looking around the small room. The V&V ranches, my father's land. It's all mine. After all these years. She had won. She had everything she'd ever fought for. Wealth, security, justice. I guess you'll be leaving then, he said. The words felt like stones in his mouth. Heading back east, maybe. Boston. Live like a queen. She walked over to him, so close he could see the exhaustion and the strength warring in her eyes. I spent my entire life in Boston, she said quietly. I was suffocating. I learned about books and numbers and how to play games with words. But I never learned how to live. Not until I came here. She reached out and touched his hand. Her fingers were rough and calloused, but her touch was gentle. You spent your last $3 on me, Caleb Rivers. A man with nothing gave me everything. Why? He looked down at their joined hands. I told you, he said, his voice hoarse. It wasn't right. What they were doing. No, she said, her gaze searching his. It was more than that. I saw it in your eyes at the auction. The same thing I feel. You were just as trapped as I was. He couldn't deny it. He was trapped by his past, by his poverty, by a world that had no place for him. So what do we do now? He asked. You're a rich woman. I'm just me. The money doesn't matter, she said fiercely. It's just paper. What matters is what we build. I've been running and fighting my whole life. I don't want to run anymore. I want to build something. Here. The words hung in the air between them, full of possibility, full of hope. This cabin, she said, a small smile playing on her lips. It's a wreck. The roof leaks and the floor is dirt. It's a terrible house. I know, he said, a matching smile growing on his own face. But it might make a pretty good home, she finished softly. He looked into her eyes, the fiery, intelligent, unbreakable eyes of Catherine Brennan, and he knew his life had been leading to this single moment. He had walked into town that day with 3 worthless coins and an empty stomach. He was walking away with a future he never could have imagined. Freedom wasn't about being untied. It was about choosing your own bonds. He reached out and gently brushed a stray piece of hair from her face. Catherine Brennan, he said, his voice full of a feeling he didn't have a name for yet. Will you stay? I choose to stay, she said, her voice full of certainty. I choose this. I choose you. It was a beginning, born from an ending. A quiet promise made in a broken-down cabin at the edge of the world. And for 2 people who had never had anything, it was more than enough. If you enjoyed this story of justice and survival on the frontier, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of the unexpected. Let me know in the comments what you think Catherine and Caleb will build together.